The world is in the midst of an inflation crisis. Since 2021, prices have been rising quickly. Inflation is hitting poor countries harder than rich ones, but there's one exception to this: the United Kingdom, which is seeing prices rise much faster than many similar wealthy countries. In fact, inflation in the UK has persistently been at or above 10% since the summer of 2022. Compare that to its neighbor France, where inflation has been hovering at around 6%. Still bad, but nowhere near as bad. Or compare it to the US, where inflation peaked at around 9% in 2022 and has been steadily falling ever since, now down below 5%. The UK's astronomical inflation is having a serious impact on society. Disgruntled workers are going on strike demanding wage hikes to make up for their lost buying power, and forecasts are calling for a spike in the country's poverty rate as more people struggle to pay for basic necessities. So why is this happening? Why is UK's inflation crisis so much worse than other countries? And what will it mean for the country going forward? In this video, we're going to answer these questions, but before we get into it, make sure to subscribe to our channel for our latest updates on the global economy. And if you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. The latest inflation data for the UK shows prices rose 10.1% in March compared to a year earlier. That's down from 10.4% the month before, but it's still high enough to give the UK the highest inflation rate in Western Europe. Now, that's not the worst inflation rate in the world. It's nowhere near the inflation rate in Argentina or Lebanon. You can check out our recent videos on the economic crises in those countries. And it's not even the worst inflation rate in Europe. For example, inflation in Poland was at 14.7% in March, after having peaked at 18.4% earlier this year. And the latest reading of inflation in Hungary shows it running at a whopping 24%. But those numbers are somewhat misleading. That's because of how inflation is calculated. The inflation rate is based on a basket of goods that consumers in a particular country typically buy, and it's weighted according to how much each kind of good and service people buy. Eastern European countries like Poland and Hungary are poorer than their Western counterparts, which means that consumers there spend less money on discretionary goods like TVs and vacations, and more on basic necessities like food and energy. And it's exactly food and energy that have been going up in price. If Britain's inflation rate was calculated the same way Poland's inflation rate is calculated, it would likely have similar inflation rates to that country. But because Britain's consumers are wealthier and spend more money on services and goods like clothes and electronics, which haven't gone up as much, the UK numbers show a lower inflation rate. One of the biggest costs driving up inflation is energy, and Europe's energy markets were thrown into turmoil last year when Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia was one of the largest suppliers of oil and natural gas to Europe, and natural gas is one of the biggest sources of energy for electricity generation. European countries, including Britain, slapped sanctions on Russia, making it increasingly difficult to source energy. Energy prices spiked in the UK from around £70 per megawatt hour in 2021 to a peak of £590 per megawatt hour in October of 2022. It was an incredible energy crisis, but it didn't last. Europe found alternative sources for energy, particularly natural gas supplies from the United States. The shift to renewable energy also accelerated, and by the end of 2022, wind and solar power were the largest sources of electricity in Europe for the first time ever. And also, Europe got lucky. The winter of 2022 to 2023 was very mild, and demand for heating energy was lower than expected. Energy prices started to fall, and by the spring of 2023, UK electricity rates had fallen around £80 per megawatt hour. That's still higher than before the crisis, but not by much. But the energy crisis in Europe was continent-wide, and while it certainly affected the UK, it affected all other countries too, from Germany to Italy to Denmark and France. So energy prices can't really explain why the UK's inflation rate is so much worse than these other countries. The reason the UK is different is not energy, it's food. In March of 2023, UK food prices were up an incredible 19.2% compared to a year earlier. That's the fastest pace of food inflation Britain has seen since 1977. It's far worse than the 7.7% increase seen in the US and worse than the 14.9% increase in France. So why are food prices increasing in the UK so much faster than in other countries? The experts point to a combination of factors which have all come together to create a perfect storm for food prices. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted supply chains and made it more difficult to get goods from the farm to the supermarket. The pandemic also led to labor shortages that made it harder for supermarkets to keep their shelves stocked. There was a bout of avian influenza that reduced the supply of chicken. Russia's invasion of Ukraine disrupted food production in those countries, and both of them are major suppliers of grains. And most recently, bad weather has played a role. In recent years, the UK has been increasingly reliant on food supplies from North Africa. That's because when the country left the European Union a few years ago, the EU slapped all sorts of tariffs and regulatory requirements on food trade with Britain, making it difficult to source food from Europe. So Britain turned to North Africa, which is a major exporter of fruits and vegetables. But in recent months, extreme weather events in North Africa have cut food production there. And North Africa itself is dependent on Russia and Ukraine for its grains. With the war raging, grain exports have shrunk, causing North African countries to go hungry. And when extreme weather hit those countries, many of them, such as Morocco, slapped restrictions on exports of food from their countries. Suddenly, the store shelves were empty in the UK. The salad crisis, as it became known, left many supermarkets without fresh supplies of fruit and vegetables. The supermarkets scrambled to find other sources of food, but it's not like there's a huge supply of food waiting for someone to buy it in an emergency. The UK supermarkets had to outbid other buyers for that food, and so they found themselves paying far more to deliver food to British customers. This whole chain reaction we just described here, the war in Ukraine causing a drop in grain shipments, leading to food shortages in North Africa, leading to export controls, leading to a food shortage in Britain, shows us just how interconnected the global economy has become. When times are good, that interconnectedness has major benefits. For instance, people in a rainy northern country like the UK can buy mangoes and bananas year-round. But when that system breaks down, it can cause a huge domino effect with unexpected consequences. Who would have thought that Russia bombing a Ukrainian grain farm would mean a shortage of fruit in Britain? And there's another reason for Britain's huge food inflation, a reason that's almost entirely unique to the UK itself. In recent times, Britain's major supermarket chains like Tesco, Sainsbury's, Morrisons, Aldi, and Lidl have been in an intense competition with each other to reduce their supply costs. These supermarkets have squeezed their suppliers to get lower and lower wholesale prices for the foods they buy, but they don't pass on those savings to consumers. They kept the difference, jacking up their profit margins. A 2018 report from Oxfam found that UK supermarkets had increased the amount they keep from the retail price of foods from 41% in 1996 to 53% in 2015. Meanwhile, the farmers who produced the food got just 5.7% of the retail price. The supermarkets got 10 times as much of the money from food sales as farmers. So when UK supermarkets went out into the world looking for alternative food supplies, they found themselves dealing with farmers who were getting far more money than the UK's regular suppliers. The UK supermarkets had no choice but to pay more for the food they bought, and not surprisingly, they passed those costs on to consumers. But Britain's inflation problem is now beginning to spread from food to everything else. We can see this in the country's core inflation rate. Core inflation is a special measure of inflation that strips out the most volatile prices. Because food and energy prices tend to be very volatile, typically rising and falling every month, they make it difficult to see what the underlying inflation trend is in an economy. So economists came up with the concept of core inflation, which strips out those factors, giving us a better look at the underlying inflation trends. In the UK today, core inflation is running at above 6%, triple the 2% core inflation rate that the country had for years prior to the current crisis. What this means is that the high costs of food and energy have spilled over into the rest of the economy. That makes sense when you think about it. Let's say you own an electronics store. The price of the consumer products you import isn't rising, but the cost of fuel that your delivery company pays is going up. The delivery company has to increase the prices it charges. So what do? You pass on the extra cost to your customers, and presto, the price of electronic goods goes up. This is happening in the UK today, and what it means is that Britain has persistent inflation. It isn't going to be easy to get the inflation rate down. Last year, the Bank of England, like central banks all around the world, started raising interest rates to fight inflation. Since the end of 2021, the UK's central bank has raised its key lending rate from 0.1% to 4.5% today. It's one of the steepest and fastest rate hikes the bank has ever undertaken. The theory is that when you raise interest rates, you make it more difficult for businesses and consumers to borrow money, which reduces consumer demand, and that, in turn, forces businesses to lower their prices to stay competitive. To an extent, this has worked, but more so in the US and in other countries than in Britain. It hasn't worked very well in the UK because higher interest rates can't stop the war in Ukraine. They can't stop wild weather from destroying crops in Morocco, and they can't stop people from going out on strike demanding higher wages. That's what has been happening in the UK in recent months. With the cost of living soaring, hundreds of thousands of workers in Great Britain have gone out on strike, demanding higher wages. Just in the past few months, the UK has seen strikes by teachers, junior doctors, nurses, ambulance staffers, regional BBC journalists, university lecturers, and rail and London Underground drivers. They're all demanding the same thing: higher wages to cover the higher cost of living. That may sound reasonable, but it poses a real problem. If wages grow at the rate of inflation, they can create an endless endless inflationary spiral. Higher wages force businesses to increase their prices. Higher prices mean more inflation, which means you need to raise wages even more. So business costs go up again, so wages go up again, and so on and so forth. This is what happened to the economies of the developed world in the 1970s during the last major inflation crisis. Wages kept going up thanks to pressure from unions, or because of government mandates, or simply because businesses were competing for the best workers and wanted to keep them happy. But the result of that was a wage price spiral that lasted 2 full decades. Inflation began rising in the early 1970s and didn't come down to its historic norms until the early 1990s. This time around, businesses and governments are being more insistent on not allowing a wage price spiral from forming, but that has its own negative consequences. Simply put, it means people become poorer. This is exactly what the UK faces today. A recent study from the Resolution Foundation forecasts that over the next 2 years, the poverty rate in the UK will climb from 17.2% of the population to 18.3%. That means an additional 800,000 people will fall into poverty. Child poverty is expected to increase to its highest level in 25 years. All of this means that the UK is stuck between a rock and a hard place. Increase wages, and you're stuck in an inflationary spiral that makes it impossible for people to save money and improve their welfare. Don't increase wages, and everyone will get poorer, with hundreds of thousands of people falling into poverty. That's the main reason why the IMF is predicting that the UK is the likeliest country among the G7 to fall into recession this year. Getting the UK out of its inflationary mess today will require more than just interest rate hikes. Given everything that's going on, from the war in Ukraine to bad weather in North Africa, it will require a big dose of luck. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button to help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to get notifications on our latest economic updates. And to learn more, click on one of these videos here. Thanks for watching.